Fairy tales are both stories of transformation and symbolic poetry. They are gifts from our ancestors, offering symbols and guidance for our human development. In this show, artist, philosopher, and teacher Sean Kramer will lead us into the imaginal realm of fairy tales, where we will find healing images and wise teachings for our own journey through this enchanted world. So welcome to Under Their Spell, meditating on fairy tales.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Sean Kramer, and this is Under Their Spell, meditating on fairy tales. Today's topic, fairy tales and archetypes. And I do not wish this session to be just a talk or lecture giving you information about some theory of archetypes. Rather, I intend to offer this as a meditation, an insight meditation, an ordered series of examples and images which can provide a path for our minds to follow in order to gain insight into the archetypes, into our own nature and the nature of fairy tales. So let us begin with a visualization meditation to relax ourselves, to sink our consciousness into the deeper levels of ourselves and the world. If it's suitable for you, you may close your eyes. Bring your awareness to your body and your breath. As you breathe in, imagine light, energy coming in through your breath, filling your body. In through your nose, mouth, down your throat, filling your arms, your torso, your legs, all the way to your feet. With each out breath, feel the out breath taking away any tension, blocks, and as you breathe out, you relax. Feel yourself maybe sinking, falling down into a deeper relaxed state. Imagine you are walking. You walk into a forest. You're walking on a path through the forest, through the trees around you. And as you walk, you start to float. You no longer need to walk or move your legs. You are just floating over the path through the forest. And going off from the path, as you move through, you see other paths veering off in different directions. And they all look similar, the same kind of path, the same pillars of trees. And as you feel inclined, as you're floating down the path through the forest, you can take any of the other paths. You float, move gently, peacefully through these paths, Whenever your feeling or intuition inclines you, you switch off to another path. They're all similar. Now as you're moving along the path you're on, it starts to go downward. As you follow it downward, as it goes down, it starts to become darker. And you can detect the path and the trees, but more and more dimly, until you can't see the path anymore and you're just floating, falling gently in darkness. The darkness, peaceful darkness of your own inner world. And then you fall gently back into your body, wherever you are at this time. And take a couple deep breaths. And let us begin our journey into the world of archetypes. And this meditation will have two main parts. The first part focused on archetypes, considering some examples that can lead us into more insight into what the archetypes are. And then, in that light, we will look at some of the fairy tales that we've already considered in this that we've covered previously, but we will see what new light and understanding the archetypes can shed on them. So let us begin to meditate on archetypes. And the word archetype has a number of meanings. It's used in a number of different ways. Sometimes it's applied in literature to refer to common character types, such as a hero, heroine, or helper, or even kind of common plot patterns. But here we're going to consider another meaning of the word archetype, a more biological sense, an evolutionary sense. A meaning of the word archetype which is found not only among humans who write literature and stories, but also in animals who do not have literature that we know of. So these archetypes are very deeply rooted in our past evolutionary nature, even going down into matter. And archetypes are such interior, really fundamental and pervasive principles of the way we experience life and the world that it can be hard at first to see them in ourselves. They're so fundamental, they're like behind us, and so, in a sense, so present that it's hard to see. So it can be easier at first maybe to identify them and their activity in other animals besides humans as a way to becoming more aware of them in ourselves. So the first example for us to meditate on is that of birds and shadows. For many birds, a moving shadow, such as the shadow of a hawk or predator, will evoke a fright response. And people have done experiments, even cutting out cardboard and moving it above to cast shadows and seeing which kind of shape evoked this response in the birds. And in the 1930s, some finches were found in South America that had not been around predator birds for hundreds of thousands of years because of their location separation. Way back in the past, they did have predator birds that they had to deal with, but for hundreds of thousands of years, these finches had no predator birds flying above and trying to catch them. And some of these finches were brought to a place where there were birds, hawks. And the first time they saw the shadow of a hawk, they started shrieking. They had never seen a hawk, seen this kind of shadow, nor had their parents, their grandparents, going back for hundreds of thousands of years. The first time they saw it, they started to shriek. There was a memory, genetic coding that had been passed down, had been unconscious to them for all these thousands of years, but was still present in them and ready to be awakened. So when these finches had that emotional response, that shrieking, fright response, they were in their emotions connected with, and in some ways responding to, not just the immediate perception of a shadow. They were connecting with the experience of their ancestor finches from hundreds of thousands of years ago. So inborn in those finches was some kind of pattern or pattern recognition system by which a certain range of shadow shapes would be experienced as something terrifying, harmful, possibly destructive of their very existence. Such inborn patterns with this power to awaken and even possess us with these deepest experience of terror or of longing and desire, these are the archetypes, or some examples of kinds of archetypes. Archetypes, and like fairy tales, are tied into our fears as well as our longings and hopes. So they are a combination of kind of a potential pattern with very deep, intense emotional responses and behaviors all connected together that are inborn and passed down through the members of a whole species. And they're connected with experiences of things that are harmful or beneficial, things to be sought or avoided, our desires and our fears. Just like fairy tales are about our deepest fears and desires. For the finches then, the hawk shadow archetype is in the category of something harmful, threatening to be avoided. An inborn response to something that could be hurtful, in which we have a strong feeling and reaction even prior to our own experience in this world. And these things which we're calling archetypes are very bodily, physically rooted. It's an intense kind of whole body experience that those finches were having. But there are also archetypes not only of threatening things to be avoided, like a shadow, frightening shadow of a hawk. There are also archetypes of desire for what is beneficial, nourishing, fulfilling for us. So let's look at another example of an archetype of desire and longing for what is fulfilling to us, and that is the Mother Archetype. In around the year 1935, the naturalist Konrad Lorenz was working with geese, and he observed how even in the egg, the baby goslings were searching for a mother, longing for a mother. They would respond back through the shell and the egg to the sounds and cheeping of the geese. And he found that if he himself was the first living and moving being that these little goslings met after hatching, they would attach themselves to him as to their mother. This meant that they would follow after him, just like you see birds or turkeys with their little babies just running after them and not wanting to be far away. So they would follow after him, Konrad Lorenz, all the time. They would look to him for their nourishment and feeding. They would feel safe when they were near him and become very distressed and frightened if they were separated or too far away from him. So in his early experiments with this, when the little baby goslings took him as their mother, he would squat down and walk around, squatted down, and he had to continually make sounds, goose-like sounds. Otherwise, the little goslings would become distressed if he stopped making the sounds. So he learned he had to constantly be making these sounds, and if he stood up, they would become distressed. They thought that their mother had left them. So there's a story that he tells when he was first doing this. He was in his yard, and he had all these baby goslings who were attached to him as their mother, so he would spend lots of time out in his yard, squatted down, walking awkwardly through the yard, making goose sounds. And the grass was so tall that you couldn't see the little geese. And his neighbors, where he lived, were one time found to be all peeping over the fence, watching him, thinking he was gone completely insane, seeing this man squatted down acting like a goose in his yard. Now later, him and his students would use boots, like rain boots with different patterns on them for the little goslings to see when they were born, so then they could wear these boots and the little goslings would follow around the boots. Some boots had stripes, some had polka dots, some had zigzags, and if the goslings were attached, and he called this imprinted, they were imprinted to the polka dot boots when they first came out of the shell, they would ever after follow around polka dot boots as their mother and stay as close as they could to it and follow wherever the person went who was wearing that kind of boots. Someone else with striped boots would not attract those goslings unless they had been imprinted with striped boots. And that particular an inborn pattern. We could say a kind of a mother pattern that they were looking for in the outer world, in an outer object onto which they could project and attach this pattern or archetype along with all the emotions and behaviors that went along with it. And this inner mother pattern or archetype was generalized. It wasn't one particular thing, but it became, or a specific image, but a general pattern that became specified by the imprinting. Whatever they experienced and whatever they found to attach this general archetype onto specified their experience of mother. And Carl Jung took the Latin word which meant a braid, to make a braid, like a braid of hair. And he said, around the archetypes, through our experiences and imprinting, things got gathered like into a braid, as if our experience of life was flowing hair that gathered into these different braids in our soul and our psyche. And the Latin word for this braiding was complexus, and so he used the word a complex, but it means a braid. Things that get gathered around the archetype through our experience. So these goslings that imprinted onto boots with stripes would be said to have their mother archetype would become a mother complex, a braid that was associated with stripes. And ever after in their life, maybe they're flying on their yearly journeys, their migrations, and they see maybe a landscape and there's fields, farms that have been planted in striped patterns. That goose will experience intense emotion. All its feelings for its mother will be reawakened through those stripes. We could say that psychologically they'd say that was his mother complex. That's sometimes used negatively. To say someone has a mother complex sounds like something's wrong with them, but everyone has a braiding or a complex around their mother archetype depending on what their experiences and imprintings were. So there's those two levels, the archetypal inborn level that we're born with as a species, and then our experiences that gather around and specify it, called a braid or a complex. Now, with these birds, when they attach to something as their mother, there became a strong set of emotions and behaviors around whatever that object they imprinted to as their mother. There was a space around it, kind of a circular radius in which they would feel safe and they could eat and play. And they would want to stay within that radius around the mother object. But outside that space, if they went beyond that sphere, that circular radius, they became very distressed and frightened. Would run back into it if they could find it, or feel very distressed, frightened, and over time very distressed and depressed if they remained outside that sphere around the mother. So the world inside the sphere around the mother was experienced as safe and nourishing and life-giving. But the world beyond that sphere was immediately experienced as threatening, stressful, disorienting, lost, a place of possible death. And this seems to be the first experience of animals, birds, mammals, and ourselves of the world. and its space. The division of the safe space around the mother and the threatening lost space outside that circle. And the first imprint of the mother archetype for an animal determines one's basic orientation or feeling about the world, whether it is a safe world or a threatening world. And one will carry that, can carry that through the rest of their life. So I think you can already see, if you remember our meditation on Hansel and Gretel, many ways in which the fairy tale Hansel and Gretel is a tale about the mother archetype and its various ways of being imprinted. Imagine if these geese would tell stories, and they wanted to tell very deep stories that would reach back to their earliest experiences, their semi-conscious memories of their development inside the egg and during those first hours of being imprinted, and the days afterward living in relation to whatever they imprinted as their mother. Those stories would be very much like Hansel and Gretel, except instead of human children and parents, it would be little geese and goslings. They would tell a story about feeling at home and safe when they were near the mother and within that sphere of nearness, about feeling lost, threatened, vulnerable when at a distance, and about trying hard and having one aim of getting back home to the mother when they were away. Just like those little birds that follow and become distressed when their mother's too far away. And they would be, when they were away from the mother or had lost their mother, they would be imagining, dreaming images of the mother archetype. When in the outer world, they could not find something that offered to be a carrier of that archetype. And so in Hansel and Gretel, we see that these little children who are left in the forest and their parents leave them and go back home. The children are outside that sphere of their parents, and all they want to do is get back. They try to get back. They do successfully one time. The next time they don't. The birds eat the breadcrumbs and they can't find their way back. There might be more significance there about the birds also then, in this light of birds as creatures who we see making nests and caring for their eggs and hatching their babies. So the little children of Hansel and Gretel, being lost, separated, away from the mother, they, in the forest of their mind, their imagination, and their dreams, the archetype arises and becomes an object of great longing, and they look for the fulfillment of that. They imagine the cake house, the gingerbread house, the place of safety and nourishment and home. And this happens to people who do not find a good object onto which to project and place their mother archetype and all those longings. A man I knew, when I first met him, he was a large, strong man, looked very tough. He looked like the typical Hell's Angel or a bouncer. But as I got to know him, he had inside of him a very frightened little child. And he told me his story that his mother, who gave him birth, was incapable of being a mother, incapable of carrying his mother archetype. She was a drug addict, irresponsible, so he spent a lot of time just left in his crib as a baby, crying for his mother neglecting him, leaving him in the crib, not changing him, not feeding him. So when he was a young boy, about 10 or 11 years old, an older boy took him out and gave him some whiskey for the first time. Opened up a whiskey bottle and let him drink from the whiskey bottle. And he said that when he drank it, he felt this warmth going through his body, this great feeling of safety and of mother, of being surrounded and held by his mother. All that he had been longing for, that was rooted in his mother archetype and had not found a response in the world, became projected onto the alcohol, the whiskey. He felt like he had found his mother. And, of course, he became addicted to alcohol for a long time. The Canadian doctor Gabor Mate, who worked a lot with addicts, has some very interesting insights about this and how addictions are not primarily the cause of certain substances, that we say this is an addictive substance, but they're about the relation of the substance to the individual and their experiences and their biochemistry. And many of them have to do with their experiences of the mother archetype and their imprinting or bad imprinting. So he says that even in the womb, the baby is trying to sense and discover and determine what kind of world it has been incarnated into, whether it's a safe or threatening world. And this is the basic content of the mother archetype, about the world is either safe or threatening. And if the mother is very stressed, such as a single mother who isn't supported, she's going to be very likely quite stressed a lot of the time. The baby is, through the mother's body, determining what kind of world this is, if it's safe or threatening. And if the mother's very stressed, the baby's whole neurobiology and neurochemistry are forming itself for a dangerous, threatening world. And it becomes more habituated to and flooded with stress hormones like cortisol. And that becomes the way its brain and neurochemistry is formed, even in the womb. And then the person feels, as they go through life, apart from the actual circumstances they're in, they feel like they're in a stressful, threatening environment. So they feel stressed, anxious, depressed. And when such a person comes upon and tries a certain drug, maybe alcohol, maybe an opiate, they don't just get high or feel good like another person might. They actually feel normal, like they may never have felt in their entire existence from the womb. They suddenly feel safe, relaxed, less anxious, able to be interested in the world, curious, relate to the world, which they never did before. So they don't just become addicted to, I'd say, getting high, but to being normal, to feeling safe, as they normally do not feel. So the archetypes, like the Mother Archetype, which the story Hansel and Gretel is a very deep and accurate portrayal of, the archetypes look to the outer world to find something or some person onto which they can be projected, which can become clothed in the archetype, and to which the animal or we ourselves will attach the archetype and its braid or complex, the things around it, as well as we will attach our needs and longings, the emotions and behavior patterns that are all involved in that archetype. There's an interesting example of some gulls, some bird gulls, whose mother has a red dot on her beak. And when the mother comes to the nest of the baby gulls, they have an inborn response to peck on the red dot. So if a person makes something and puts a red dot on it and puts it near the nest, the little baby birds will automatically peck on it. And when the mother has that red dot pecked upon, her response, inborn response, is to regurgitate her food and to feed the little babies in the nest. So imagine the art, if those gulls grew up and would develop images that move them, they would likely have a lot of art with big red dots. And artists who made paintings with big red dots would attract viewers to galleries and museums. You would see these gulls standing around enjoying looking at paintings with big red dots, because it would evoke these deep archetypal feelings that were not only of their experience, but were awakening the kind of material genetic memory going back of their whole species. Now let's look at another fairy tale that we've seen before and consider some other aspects of archetypes that it can show us. So let's look at the Frog Prince, which we looked at last time. And the Frog Prince, as you might remember, had three parts. The first scene is the little girl in the forest with her golden ball, which falls down into a well, and out comes a prince in the form of a frog. Then the story goes back home where she's with her father, and she is disgusted with the frog, which is following her, wanting to eat at her table and sleep in her bed. And the last scene in her bedroom, where the frog turns into the attractive prince. She's no longer repulsed, but happy, in love with him. And this tale is about archetypes, but not just the archetypes, but the aspect of the archetypes in their progression. the archetypes are not static things. They are part of the life process and motivating our life process on our development. So the Mother Archetype, which Hansel and Gretel is about, is one of the first, maybe the first powerful archetype, and on which we depend as baby animals for our very survival, that attachment and experience of the mother or the parent. But as we grow, that changes, and our growth is involved and actually motivated by a change and progression of archetypes arising and returning, diminishing, other archetypes arising. And that's what this story, The Frog Prince, symbolizes so very well. So in the beginning, the little girl goes into the forest. And the forest is very interesting because it's a place where we go from animal life to the plant life, the trees in the forest, and then they are rooted in matter, the inorganic matter of the earth, the rocks, and the soil. So the girl going into the forest is an image of us going down into that level of our unconscious where life meets the material, the matter, and how the structures of matter, the chemistry, the coding in matter is a foundation for our life and the archetypes. There was in 1997 a biologist took some neural cells from quail embryos and inserted them into chicken embryos. And the chickens were born and they exhibited specific behaviors which were species specific to quails. The chickens sang quail songs and showed certain bobbing head movements that were specific to quails, not to chickens. So those songs and movements were transmitted to the chickens through these neural cells out of the quail embryos, showing the mysterious material foundation and basis or kind of carrier of the archetypes in matter. So the girl goes into the forest where life meets matter. The trees are rooted in the earth. And there she has a golden ball that falls down into the well and perhaps originally came out of the well. When the ball goes down into the well, it sinks down beyond what you can see, and then up out comes a prince, but he's in the form of a frog, but it's the prince. It's her mate, her sexual mating partner, or the image of a mate. It comes out of this realm of the archetypal material memory of the species. So it's a symbol of that changing period of a girl from living in the childhood world of her childhood archetypes, and then changes start happening in her, arising from her material physical level that start to bring forth a new archetype, an archetype symbolized by a prince, an archetype of a sexual partner and mate. So the archetypes through our life change. And the fairy tales are symbolizing often this progression of archetypes that arise, have a period of strong energy and effect for a period of our life, and then maybe sink back into the unconscious, like the ball going back down into the well. And then new archetypes will arise. And when an archetype arises in us, it restructures and rechannels our desires and longings. Just like the girl, her desires and longings were centered on the toy and the ball. But now a new archetype is arising in her soul, and it's restructuring her desires so that there's something new that she's going to desire that is channeling her desires toward further step in her maturation of her as an individual of her particular species. So when an archetype arises, as they continually do through our life, we then search our environment for possible carriers onto which we can project that archetype. So a little child, if they're in a normal growing environment, they spend a period where they're not looking for a mate, they're not aware of sexual mating cues and behaviors. Those just are not part of how they experience the world and the things they notice. But then when the archetype of the mate arises, of the sexual partner, then the person experiences the world very differently. And they start to notice and see things that were not part of their perceptual system before. This is something common with a lot of animals, but some experiments were done with jackdaws, and they notice things that move and move in certain ways, and those are objects of prey, they're food for them. But then the things that don't move and don't move in that way become part of a general, almost like a gray realm of their experience, and the only things that stand out are these things that move. And that's a reason why insects will freeze. Sometimes we say they're playing dead, but they become invisible to the bird predator because its perceptual system is as if there's this general bland background and then things that are moving. But the archetype does that. It changes so that new things become noticed to us and other things become less noticed. So as the archetype of the sexual partner arises, then we notice sexual cues and behaviors that we did not notice before because of that archetype in us, and we look for someone to become the carrier of that archetype for us. So good literature and art are ways for us to develop healthy braids or complexes around the archetypes. The archetypes have an intentionality and a progression through our life. They have a purpose, they're moving us. But the things that get attached to or imprinted on the archetype affect our development for better or worse. So a good literature and art will attach things, will specify, take our archetypes and attach images and stories and experiences to them in a way that help us to grow and develop. So a little child hearing the story of the Frog Prince is being given which can be attached to their awakening archetype in a way that will help them reach the intentionality of the archetype. But bad art or literature will do the opposite, will hinder the individual from finding the fulfillment, intended developmental fulfillment of that archetype. The golden sphere that the girl has could also be a symbol of the whole kind of bundled glow of all the archetypes and their potential that is in the child. And that's a suggestion that in childhood, the archetypes in their promise and potentiality are present and experienced by the child and projected all around the world onto things, the archetypes of longing and threat, so that the world has this intensity and glow of it. But then that bundle of kind of the full archetypes in their fresh potential sinks back down into the unconscious, and then specific archetypes arise out of that in a progressive order that is trying to lead us in our mature development to realize them all. So the symbol of the archetypes in their fresh potential is often a sphere, but then at the end of life, their actualization will be symbolized by a finely cut gemstone or crystal that's faceted, that has been crystallized and faceted and complexified through our experience, but beautifully perfected. The prince as the frog is symbolic of that in-between phase when the archetype of the sexual partner starts to arise in the child or young person, but other parts of them, their emotional system, their psychology, are not ready for that. So there's an attraction and repulsion phase until they mature, and then the archetype of the mate, the sexual partner, can be placed onto someone in a way that is fulfilling and happy, as happens at the end of the tale. So the archetypes then are not just static images, and they're not even specific images, they're kind of pattern potentials that get fixed on certain images through our experience and through our imprinting. And as we go through life, we go through phases where the old archetypes sink back into the unconscious or semi-conscious, and new archetypes arise which then reorganize and structure our desires. And we are in a phase of an imprint vulnerability to which things can get attached to that archetype. As adolescence is an example of that things that we meet when some of these new strong archetypes are arising get attached to them and stay for the rest of our life. So the fashions, the clothing fashions that a young person meets in their adolescence that at the time are fashionable and associated with desirable partners become and remain attractive to them often for the whole rest of their life, and later fashions cannot have that effect on them because they've passed that period of the fresh archetype with infant vulnerability, and they don't understand the later fashions. So let me conclude this meditation on fairy tales and archetypes, which the topics will continue in our further meditations. We'll go more deep into them, but I wanted to lay some foundations, some basic insights. But let me finish by making a connection between fairy tales and dreams through the archetypes. People recognize that fairy tales and dreams have a lot of similarities. Fairy tales seem like dreams, and dreams can seem like fairy tales. And one reason is that at night, one thing that is happening is we are going back into the forest, into those deeper levels of ourselves, where the archetypes are, in the deep levels of our soul and our body, our genetic coding. And our dreams are a natural process of trying to connect, integrate, and relate our own personal experience of life as an individual with that whole material genetic memory of the species that is housed deep in our body and our psyche. And dreams are that process, an expression of that process. So a very strong emotional dream, if it's very intense, that's a sign that an archetype has been touched in that dream. And the fairy tales are similar to that. They are also stories that reach down to that level and are helping us connect our individual story, our individual life process, development, and journey with this very deep journey of our whole species and the experiences and memories that have been passed on to us in the archetypes. So is Selamon, are you there? Do we have any comments or questions?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great. It's a very, very great episode. Very interesting stuff here. And while I was listening to you talk, it seems like that archetypes play a really big role in our lives. And I was just wondering, do you think that the archetypes kind of help us as humans make sense of the world that we're living in?
Oh yes, they do. They have, just by themselves they do, and our own reflection and understanding really helps us make sense of that, of how we experience the world, of what is happening. And it's very, I think, especially helpful and insightful if we see the progression of the archetypes through the developmental stages of life, and then notice that in ourselves. I've been helped a lot. There's special things that happen with the archetypes at around midlife, like late 30s, early 40s, that Carl Jung noticed and really wrote a lot about. But just like during adolescence, which I talked about, or the early childhood, and it's very helpful to know about that for ourselves, to be aware of what is happening and to cooperate with it, so we can move forward with their intentionality, their development, and cooperate with it is very helpful for our own personal growth.
I like that. You also said how in the Frog Prince the partner came into her life, but it was a frog because she wasn't quite ready for that archetype to be fulfilled, and then when she was ready, the frog turned into a prince, and that was fulfilled. So I thought it was a really cool episode.
Yeah, and I think to me it's very enlightening, and it really opens up some of the depth of the fairy tales that the tellers had very deep insight into, not maybe using our same language, but they saw into these things and put them into symbols for us.
Yeah, very cool. Thank you.
You're welcome. Shall we finish with a meditation?
That's fine with me.
Okay. So let us use our breath to carry us into our inner being, our inner psyche, our connection with our bodies. And move your awareness to your center, your solar plexus, your third chakra around your belly. And imagine, feel the energy there, like a sun, burning, glowing, radiating. And imagine and feel that energy going down through your legs into the earth, into the material matrix of the universe, and connecting with that, all the depths, mystery, and power that we are part of, the whole history of the universe, ourselves, our species, and draw from that energy into your body. And then imagine the energy from your center going up through the top of your head, up through the sky, out into space, and connecting with the spiritual beings who are guiding us through these archetypes toward the evolutionary fulfillment of ourselves, the species, and the universe, and draw that down into yourself. And we thank you, all the heavenly powers. We ask you to enlighten us on our journey, to help us understand our nature, our purpose, and to follow the steps of our life in the way that will most help our own evolution and the evolution of all humans and all the world.